Hello. This week, well, I've hitched a lift on a Dutch ship, the Steel Sprinter, out of Rotterdam, to take me across the grey waters of the North Sea into the muddy brown waters of the Great Ouse, the river that leads us up to the ancient port of King's Lynn. And yeah, you're absolutely right. This shirt's better suited to the South Seas than the North Sea. You know, all sorts of people wax lyrical about King's Lynn's medieval prosperity, about its wealth of medieval and Elizabethan buildings. I think that's all a load of old junk. And there's your first riddle. What's the connection, do you think, between King's Lynn and rubbish? And I'll give you a clue. I'm not talking about any old refuse. I'm talking about rubbish from the 900s and 1000s. Lynn was the heart of a widespread trading network. Russian furs, Scandinavian timber, Spanish wine, all came in across her quaysides. Just fish and chips, please. Please, yeah. But what did Lynn export? Now, they were coming here to Lynn for grain from the farmlands all in the hinterland, for fish from the North Sea fisheries, but the main reason they came to King's Lynn was for something which this place had by the barrel load. Oh, sugar. Well, salt, actually. Now, a lynn's a small lake, and the salt workings and shanties that grew up on this lynn gave the place its name. But how do salt workings work? Well, I'll demonstrate with the aid of a large beach and a small bucket. Right, so if you'd like the medieval recipe for salt, pen and paper's at the ready, here we go. You take a very large container, not like this little bucket, and you fill it with masses of sand. Sand that's heavily laden with salt from the seashore. Then you sluice seawater through it, and that takes out all the salt from the sand and leaves you with a really thick, grungy brine. What they then do is build massive fires underneath and then evaporate all the water out of the container, and that left the salt crystals behind. Clever, eh? It's not Rick Stein, this, is it? What the early time and motion studies don't tell us is precisely how long it took for salt makers to evaporate a pound of salt. So here I am, still here, watching a pot that never boils. Until finally, hours later, when the tide's gone out and the sun's gone in, and I'm left freezing my little bottom off on this beach, you've got salt. The real, genuine article. But I'd stick to getting it from the supermarket if I were you. It's a hell of a sight easier. But before I cycle off into the sunset, or into the back of the camera car, what about that question? King's Lynn and a load of rubbish. Have you guessed the answer yet? Well, I'll tell you. In days gone by, in the early Middle Ages, none of this was here. It was all salt water. The tide came in and out. But the salters, they actually used all the sand, all the surplus sand, when they were making salt, remember, with the brine? And when it was finished with, they dumped it. Where else did they dump it except into the river? And gradually, all that surplus sand, the dead saltons, built up and created dry land, solid land, on which they built King's Lynn. But the bustling port of Lynn wasn't always on the banks of the Great Ouse. Once it stood here on the banks of the Nar, and it wasn't just merchant ships that tied up here. From a very early stage in its history, young lads from Lynn would join up and go to sea to earn good wages and get a taste of adventure in a trade, well, how can I put it? You need to make a connection between cutlery and ladies' underwear. And here's your clue. The cutlery wasn't your usual standard stainless steel, and the trade, well, that was an oil bonanza, and it paid the same sort of wild wages that oil riggers were earning a century later. Spoon? Thank you. Fork? Not plastic Bakelite 1930s cutlery, but 18th or 19th century knives, forks and spoons, carved by sailors on very long voyages away from their home port. Perhaps even used by the lad who carved them, you never know. Now think about the frilly ladies' underwear. Ladies' underwear to keep you in shape. Every March, 5 ships left Lynn bound for the ice-flecked waters of the Greenland fishery. These men were the heroes of the seas, bearing away into the northern waters to pit their frail craft and fragile bodies against Leviathan, the men that fished the whale. This is what was used to hunt them. This is a harpoon. It was attached to a great shank of wood, and the harpooner would balance on the bows of a very small boat on a very huge sea, with these great creatures rolling up and underneath them. Once the whale had been harpooned, the sea all around it would have incarnadined. It would have turned red with the blood of the beast. And then, as it began to run away from its tormentors, the line on the end of the pole was paid out from the bottom of the boat. And that's when many an accident happened. The whale would dive, it could capsize the boat. Guys could get their legs jammed in the rope as it paid out. It was a nightmarish business for the men hunting the whale. But for those that made it back to Lynn, oh boy, that was a welcome fit for heroes. A day to remember, a sight to behold. The ships came up the river to a town gone wild in a frenzy of excitement to see the fleet safely returned. What they were quite keen to forget, however, was this. Thank you. This is a blubber pan. Because over the weeks that followed the return of the fleet, the whale carcasses were actually rendered down. The blubber was rendered down into oil in factories behind us here. The stench was abominable, and it hung over the town for weeks in the hot summer weather. It was just awful. So bad, in fact, that I suspect the Lynn folk decided to deal with it by creating a bit of an old wives' tale. Round here in those days, they liked to tell you that the smell was really good for you, and you should get a nice deep breath. Mind you, the sailors probably thought that was a load of old tosh. They knew exactly what was really good for you. What was good for you was a night in this place. Like sailors the world over in any period in history, as soon as they got back to port, where was the first place they went? The alehouse. In this case, the Greenland fishery, the place where they all congregated to spend their hard-earned shore money on a cracking night's rest and relaxation. The whalers came here so often, they renamed the place the Greenland Fishery Beer House. Mind you, they could have called it the Teetotalers' Tap Room for all the whalers cared. They'd earned their all-too-rare pleasures and were determined to enjoy them to the full. And if they'd a tendency to ogle the landlord's daughter with their hourglass figure, full in the foresail and broad in the beam, much like myself, they were merely expressing a professional interest. Because if a woman looked in good shape to the whalers, it was entirely down to their good officers. A woman's corset was shaped with lengths of whalebone. Of course, it's not everyone that knows that, But Ian Chipperfield knows, because he still makes them.
These are a pair of half-bone stays, which means that there's a space between each bone. There's probably 80 to 90 pieces of whalebone that's been individually cut by the staymaker. So you're possibly looking at 80 or to 100 feet length of whalebone.
How many pairs of stays would a woman of fashion own?
In the 18th century, probably 2 at least. In the 19th century, she could be looking at 4 or 6 or more. Certainly Victorian trousseau usually recommend that she has 4 pairs of corsets, a pair for evening wear or to wear with a wedding dress, a pair for day-to-day wear after that, an evening wear pair after that, and then 1 as a general purpose pair as well.
Wow. Because they were in fashion for an inordinate amount of time, weren't they?
Yes. The whales had a very unfortunate time because every woman in society in the 18th century, in the 17th century, and the 16th century would have been wearing stays made of whalebone.
So when did that die out?
Whalebone is still around being used by dressmakers in the 1930s, but probably from corsetry disappeared by the end of the First World War.
Really? Mm. Do you think I might have left it too late?
There's always a chance. There's always a chance.
All right, here's a little brain teaser for you over the break. What's the connection between lovely King's Lynn and the humble Conker? Go on, you'll never guess it. The Great Ooze. Isn't that deliciously onomatopoeic? You know, when a word sounds exactly like what it describes. And this sludge of waterborne mud is well named the Ooze. Mind you, the Great Ooze has got a great problem. The problem is that all the rivers that feed into the Great Ooze come out of the fens. And they come out of the fens heavily laden with silt. Now that silt gets dumped here in the tidal washes of the Ouse. And it means that the navigable channel, the channel that gets the ships in and out of the port of King's Lynn, that navigable channel is constantly on the move. It's so unpredictable that even experienced seagoing captains couldn't rely on being able to navigate their way safely in and out of the port. Which means they all have to rely on the services of the Lynn pilots. Lynn's a tricky port to get into. In December 1889, the SS Wick ran aground, totally blocking the channel, and it took 4 years to clear. All in all, it was a bit of an inconvenience. People even wondered if it mightn't be worth getting something organised to stop it happening again. Well, I don't know. Worth a try, I suppose. So they set up the King's Lynn Conservancy Board, and in 1898, the pilots set up shop in the old public baths. And they're still there. The pilots are busy today. They've got 6 large ships waiting to come in on the tide. And we're going out to that Dutch steel ship. He's waiting out in the wash for his pilot, senior pilot Graham Guy, and yours truly. I've got to ask you this, because I noticed on the chart, one of the major channels is called Teetotal Channel.
Yeah, and we always thought this was a bit humorous, the fact that it was called Teetotal Channel. You know, I mean, with seamen over the centuries and years have always been drinkers, most of them anyway, you know.
I just assumed it was because it was so difficult to get in and out of. You wouldn't want to have been on the juice beforehand.
No, I have no idea what it's called that. No.
When you go out to an incoming vessel and you go on the bridge, are you actually in charge of the boat then?
We take charge of the vessel, but we're not in command. The master is always in command. We're there in a advisory capacity only.
Right, but you'd have to be pretty stupid not to take your advice, really.
I would say so, I would say so, yes, yes.
Bustle of fuss, you just go between the boys. I could do that.
Yes, you could on a day like today, but I think it'd be different, slightly different in other adverse weather conditions and darkness and things like that, because you have to know that.
You do know I'm only teasing, don't you?
Of course I do, of course I do, yes.
Didn't want to take me seriously.
Correct. Yes, correct.
But presumably there are like nights in January and February and you come in, you wouldn't even be able to see the boys even at this distance.
That's correct, that's correct.
118 Martian land, yeah.
Yes, that's the other one, isn't it? Fog would be.
That's right, fog is really, my mind is the worst. Yeah, yeah.
Then you earn your money.
Yes, we do. Yeah, that way. That's correct, yeah.
One of King's Lynn's most famous sons went down the river just like that, out into the great wide world beyond. George Vancouver, the explorer, guy who gave his name to Vancouver Island in Canada. And of course the most famous of all King's Lynn's sons, Robert Hambling. What do you mean, Robert who? Robert Hambling, you know. And that's your question. In what way did Lynn luminary Robert Hambling shed light on troubled waters? Robert Hambling was the owner of a small coaster, and after witnessing a shipwreck, he set to work to devise a nighttime navigation aid. His idea was simple: put a light on a ship. He was the first man to patent the light ship. Of course, it had its faults. In the early models, the flame had a tendency to blow out in severe weather. But there must have been many a sailor who's blessed Bob Hambling on a dark, stormy night with a lee shore looming. By the 1700s, the markets at King's Lynn were amongst the largest and most impressive in the whole of East Anglia. You can't overestimate the importance of King's Lynn Market to the communities that lay in the hinterland behind the port. Don't forget, you know, there were no supermarkets around in the 13 and 1400s. This is where you came, not just to sell your goods, but to buy the stuff you needed. And because it was so vital to the communities it served, there were very strict rules and regulations to prevent all the higglers and hucksters from profiteering at the expense of those communities. So here's your riddle. If they caught a dodgy geezer doing something fishy on the market, did he get the chop? In 1758, a waterman from Ely called Samuel Starkey was found guilty of forestalling. He bought smelts from a fisherman and then sold them upriver instead of bringing them to the market.
pork chops now, look. They're £4 in weight, all fresh English pork chops there, £4 in weight for a fiver now. Last of them now.
Cool, look at that, cauliflower, can't beat it, missus. The other practice that people loathed was called regrating. Now, that actually took place here on the marketplace. What would happen is someone would go around in the morning and secretly, before the start bell, because all the trade, you see, took place between a start bell at the beginning of the day and a finishing bell at the end. Just like the stock exchange, you could not trade outside of those bells. But what these guys would do is they go around and they buy up the entire stock of a single item, say kippers, which meant that they cornered the market and created a monopoly. So they could hike the price up as high as the market would bear. But of course, one guy who tried that was a chap called Thomas Cadman, obviously a very bad man, because he tried to corner the market in, of all things, pork chops. But it didn't work out for him, because he ended up serving a 2-month prison sentence for blatant profiteering. Obviously, the people in King's Lynn put a very high premium on their mixed grills. Law and order on market days was always a bit of a headache. There were tricksters behind the stalls and cut pursers amongst the crowds. These days, well, things are a lot quieter. Now, this is the market superintendent. In centuries gone by, he was known as the head butler of the Tuesday market, but he's known as Ian to his mates and Toby to the market traders.
That's great.
Why is that?
I don't know the full meaning of Toby. The one story I had heard was that it is actually an old slang or a thieves' word for the road. So you had high Toby, which would effectively be highway robbery, and you had low Toby, which was a sort of footpad. Pickpocket type idea. Where I fall into that category, I don't know. But obviously, the toll man has always been known as the Toby, whether it's because we're then expected to go round and rob them of their hard-earned cash.
Taking the bread out of their mouths.
It could be taking it away, but the toll man has always traditionally been the Toby.
In the past, I mean, there was a guy here in the 18th century who had to have a bout, what we call a minder, because he was getting so much aggravation off the stallholders, they were having to go round with a bouncer.
Yeah, I can fully believe it. You know, they've come, they're earning the money, and there's this fella from the town taking it all away from them.
Do you want me to come around and help you collect the money?
Yeah, I think this is just the person I need.
Good, let's go.
Just a big man, right? We'll go for it.
Aha, remember this? You thought I'd forgotten about this, didn't you? All right, what is the connection then between Conkers and King's Lynn? Well, it's one of those strange but true stories. During the First World War, they were firing so many shells on the Western Front that they actually began to run out of an essential ingredient in the propellant for those shells, the cordite. They began to run out of acetone. And some boffin decided that the horse chestnut, nearly lost it, the horse chestnut actually contained acetone. If it was processed in the right way, you could extract it. So, in 1917, children, as they always did, went out to collect conkers. But that year, they were doing it not for their own pleasure, but as part of the war effort. And that's how 3,000 tons of conkers came by rail to King's Lynn to be processed in the factories. And luckily, within a couple of years, they were back to using them for the more peaceful purposes that we'd all prefer them to be used for. So, next week, I'll be on a canal that I've never even heard of, looking around in an old loft, and pedalling like mad to beat the tide back across the causeway before it sweeps me out to sea. See ya.